Wonderful. It's 3 o'clock and I think we're ready to start. If nobody stops me, that's how we're going to get into today's webinar on a global perspective on disability inclusion. Welcome everybody, and I'm very happy to be here. Hello, my name is Fides Raffel from myAbility, and I'm very glad to see that we've had such a good reception for today's training. Maybe a few informations on today's setup. We are on Mentimeter. So in order for you to also be able to join us live when it comes to the presentation and a few interactive parts that we have planned, please go to www.menti.com. The code is 39446871. I'll repeat that, 39446871. And there's also a QR code on the current slide, and my lovely colleagues are here to support you every step of the way in case there's any type of difficulty. I see hearts bubbling in, which is always the fun part. So welcome also to the technical part of our presentation. Translation, by the way, we have a speech to text interpreter present at all time. 2 actually, they will be switching while we speak. So in case you would like to activate subtitles, please do that via the options. You click on more and then show subtitles, and you will have the live subtitles activated. Today's webinar will last for approximately 75 minutes. For those of you who have already joined one, we're going to try to be through with the main part in the first hour and then give you the possibility to join a Q&A, especially because we have a wonderful guest today that will introduce herself in just a moment. Thank you. And I think we can actually start with a tiny introduction. We know that a lot of you have been in touch with myAbility beforehand, especially because a lot of the contacts are coming straight out of organizations, part of our business network. For those of you who are new, hi, very lovely to have you. And just as an information, myAbility is a consultancy on disability inclusion, and we have a strong focus on the German-speaking countries, but are also hosting projects Europe and worldwide. We're based in Vienna, Austria, and we offer quite a broad range of strategic consultancy products. We run a business network, we have a student talent program, and many other things. Me personally responsible for the part of training and consulting, the department that I'm currently running. And we're also very excited to get a little bit of you in today's session, but we will get to that in a moment. Firstly, as I stumbled across the topic of today's webinar, there's maybe a 1-minute story to that. I've been with myAbility for 5 years now, and a little more than a year it's been since I started as head of solution and trainings. And I've thought about how to set up our training and consulting services together with the lovely team, and especially how on a global perspectives, all or many organizations are working towards a more inclusive future, all the organizations that we work with. We as myAbility are part of a number of global networks. Just to name 2 of them, the Valuable 500, which is also how I got in touch with our partner organization today, and the ILO's Disability Network. And we're happy to be giving you an insight today a little bit into some of the international aspects of disability inclusion. And because I was looking into how to actually put a more global perspective into our work, I'm very happy to currently be working from Buenos Aires, Argentina, still for myAbility and also in cooperation with incluyeme. And incluyeme is also a consultancy on disability inclusion that you're going to be hearing a lot more about, and our guest and the star and keynote speaker of today's webinar, Gabriela Garciadiego, will shortly introduce herself. Gabby, please give us a little insight before you give us the big insight. Wait, you're still muted.
That would be helpful. Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation, Fides. I'm Gabi Garciadiego. I'm Director of Operations of incluyeme.com. I'm really happy for this invitation to talk a little bit more of what we do. We are based in Latin America, and if it's okay, can I share my screen with the presentation, or is it?
We'll get to the presentation
Okay.
and the deep dive in just a second.
Super.
Perfect.
So I'm
Thank
okay
you
with
very
my
much.
introduction.
When working with incluyeme, and I think Gabi, you will also touch that in a few moments when you get deeper into incluyeme. What we have found out so far, I think, is that it got evident from the very first training that that I got to join, was that the questions from the organizations and the participants side were quite similar in a lot of ways. Of course, there are differences, but a lot of the things just keep coming up again, and especially the skepticisms are very, very similar. Doesn't really matter whether people are working for a big organization in the Latin American market or in Europe. And we will touch those global questions and the question whether maybe some of the anxieties that organizations may be confronted with are actually the same. But first, we want you to have an insight into what incluyeme is doing just in a moment. What we want to give you today is an international perspective on the challenges of inclusion, as I've said, and we want you to learn about international best practices that I know Gabi has prepared. We want the relatability to your own scope of action to actually come up and give you the chance to connect the global challenges and some of the things that you may know from yourself and your daily business. So we really want to give you the meta perspective on what disability inclusion means globally, and then also connected to some of the things that you may be able to take directly from today's webinar to your desk or to your home office space. Thank you for everything so far, which was mainly listening, but now we would like to actually go into a little bit of an interaction phase before we hear more about incluyeme. And for that, please remember the Menti code, and we would love for you to actually join us and ask you, do you know these people and their disability? There are 4 pictures and there are 4 disabilities that are listed. And we would love for you to actually answer the question whether you have heard about these people and whether you know about their disabilities. I'll give you a second. There is somebody who's asking whether we will provide the slide. And yes, we obviously will. So there is a picture of Muhammad Ali, and somebody already guessed his disease in the chat, which is the guess of Parkinson. Then there's Frida Kahlo, who's also listed here. And we will also provide you, obviously, with the names in the solution slide. What we want to get into here is really just an information about how you know that we start our trainings as well this way. There are more people who actually have a disability who you might not know from the very beginning, not only famous people, obviously, but some of them listed here. The 3rd picture is Andrea Bocelli. Somebody already typed that in the chat as well, who has a visual impairment. And then Sebastian, I'm asking you because I do not know the perfect way of writing the name of the first person graduating from Harvard Law School with a hearing and visual impairment when it comes to the way of pronouncing her name.
Yeah, her name is Haben Girma, and she's the first person with a hearing and a visual impairment to graduate from Harvard Law School and is nowadays a civil rights attorney in the US with a special focus on disabilities.
Thank you. And just to make sure that we have the correct spelling, can you put that in the chat, please? That would be lovely. So we've had Muhammad Ali, you've guessed him, who had Parkinson's disease. We've had Frida Kahlo, who had a mobility impairment. Andrea Bocelli, very, very famous singer with a visual impairment. And Haben Girma, sorry for the pronunciation, who, as I've mentioned, is part of the Harvard alumni. There are many, many more. We keep switching them out. And obviously, there's always a really, really fun part for people in a small scale training to find out about whether maybe within their organizational context, there are people with disabilities. And that's how just we like to get into the possible references also historically that people may have to the topic of disability. We go on, we would love to hear from you whether you know, and this is very much the information that we know incluyeme gives in the beginning as well, 1 in 7 people have a disability worldwide. And obviously there are a lot of disabilities that are still invisible. 70% of all disabilities, more or less, depending on the data, are invisible. And there are a lot of people, about 250 million people with a disability worldwide that are unemployed, which obviously makes a great connection point between the office, the services of disability inclusion and business world. Not a lot of people are thinking of the talent pool, but more and more are that you can tap into when we're talking about disability inclusion. And we would love to hear from you, because that is what we're going to cover today. What are challenges of inclusion that you know of in your scope of action? There's a word cloud now, so you're free to enter whatever, and I will do my best to audio describe the things that are entered. What are the challenges of disability inclusion that you know of in your scope of action? There are actually already 2 people entering finding talents, which is one of the things that we are confronted with a lot. We will hear about some of the projects that incluyeme is doing. Accessibility is a really big factor. Flexible work times is mentioned. And looking behind the disability, so putting the person first. This is actually something that came out quite quickly when we got in touch with incluyeme via Valuable 500, that our way of looking at disabilities is a very, very similar one, which I'm actually quite excited for you to hear about from Gabby. And then there's access to education, mental illnesses, communicating vacancies, then certain disabilities are mentioned, such as hearing impairments. Uncertainty is a really, really big factor, and I think that is what we're going to tap into as well as stereotypes and potential biases. The biases of leadership, which is something that both incluyeme and myAbility are addressing in training settings, the return to work of inclusion managers, that is mentioned in the chat as well, and the willingness to staff people with disability on projects. That is also something some of you have mentioned in the chat. So actually finding not only leaders or people leaders, but the willingness in all people involved, project leaders as well, to actually staff people with disabilities. And then obviously people who might have a disability and are still not declaring that towards their organization. That is always also a really, really important part. Convincing the leadership, ableism is mentioned here, and hiring came again. Flexibility, intersectionality, also a very, very interesting part that I know incluyeme has worked with. So actually looking at where different diversity factors intertwine, such as migration and disability, for example, gender and disability. These are also really, really important steps a lot of the organizations that we're working with are taking. Thank you very much. There is another person who is writing hiring people in the right role and not minor roles. So actually giving the credibility to well-educated people with disabilities as well. And I can tell you that we're going to cover a lot of the things that you are mentioning right here to actually do what we have already mentioned is our goal for today, to actually conclude today's session with some of the meta global perspectives and some of the things that you can take for your personal scope of action. Thank you very much for your insights. And we're giving a very, very interesting insight on those small scale problems and challenges. Before we start, we would like for you to actually also answer, what do you think are challenges of inclusion in international companies? So as opposed to the things that you have been in touch with, as a second question, on a bigger scale, what are challenges of inclusion in international companies or international contexts? I will audio describe again. So people are saying accessible communication, prejudice, accessibility, again, different cultures. So that is also where different diversity spheres come together. The idea of meritocracy, very, very well put. Thank you. Pushbacks that people have to deal with, English and language barriers in general, potentially different needs of different target groups, potentially fears that people may have, the awareness and scaling of awareness, which is a really, really big part as well, that has to come from within, and that you may be able to connect to some of the best practices we're going to hear. Varying labor laws, that's a really, really good one, especially when it comes to quota, but also all the things connected to the quota, and intercultural differences. I will happily also not just share the slides, but we will translate them in an alternative text format in order to make them readable for everybody. But I think what comes out quite clearly in these challenges on a small and a bigger scope is that some of the problems that people may face in their everyday work or on an organizational level are actually quite similar, especially on a global perspective, where that is added with cultural differences or language barriers. But apart from that, prejudice, bias, ableism is something that comes out on all those levels. Thank you, thank you, thank you. You're actually giving even more insights with these two perspectives in order to compare them and in order to dive right into what we want, namely give you an insight into how another really, really interesting global organization operates when it comes to disability inclusion. I would love to now give the stage to Gabby and actually welcome incluyeme. Let's hear it from you. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Wait a second, please.
And while Gabby is sharing her presentation, obviously you are free to also pose questions while we're speaking. We're then going to have a moderated Q&A as soon as we're done with the interview format that we're going to do right after Gabby's presentation. Let's go.
Thank you very much. It was super helpful, this little exercise, because all of the insights that you're giving me, it's why incluyeme exists in Latin America. So incluyeme.com, it's a B Corp that its main mission, it's the social and labor inclusion of people with disability. So Fides gave you some statistics. I'm giving you more statistics, but focused on Latin America. So 85 million people with disabilities are living in Latin America, which of them, 75% are unemployed. This is due to a lot of the question issues, barriers that you just wrote on the exercise that we just did. And 80% of disabilities are acquired between the ages of 18 and 64, which is the age, the workable age. I'm apologizing since now because I'm a little rusty on my English, so please be patient with me. But we started in 2013 in Argentina, in Buenos Aires. I'm based in Mexico City, and we're now present in 11 countries of Latin America. Incluyeme.com started as a job board, and we soon realized that we had to do much more for companies and to help this issue, not only accompanying companies and introducing people with disabilities with the vacancies that we got hired, but also as education form, and I'm gonna give you a little bit of insight in a little while. So these are some of the 600 companies that we work with and that we're still working with and that have trusted us in guiding them in a little bit of these issues of inclusion. This is also some of the organizations, as Fides was mentioning, that we met each other through Valuable 500. Also, our CEO is a young global leader from the World Economic Forum. And we're currently working with United Nations in some projects. We're also doing a project with Google.org and the Inter-American Development Bank here in Latin America. So it's super fun that we did this exercise because from all the issues that you and challenges that you comment, we actually in incluyeme built this model. So it was easier. It could be overwhelming for some companies to talk about disability. Where do we start? Do we start by talking about issues of accessibility? Do we start communicating the programs that we have? Do we start processes? And it's funny because everything that you said, we actually targeting in some way. So we created this model to measure, guide, and define the level of social labor inclusion of people with disability within a company or organization. And we focus on data and not perceptions. This approach allows us to implement concrete strategies and provide tools to contribute to developing diverse and inclusive organization and strategies. As you can see, our main axis of this model is culture. So this is what you were saying, where we have to build a culture that it's against ableism, that treats or does exercises about biases, that it's really convincing about hiring diverse talent. And by each one of these axes, we have done some projects, strategies, so that it's easier for companies to present it as a project and as an exercise to leaders. So with culture, we have several challenges. We have guidance to improve, prioritize awareness, where you were saying about leaders, how to convince them that this issue is important, that we have to talk about ableism to eliminate biases or make conscious those biases. So we really believe that equitable society, it's a win-win for everyone. So we took all our customers and decided what the main issues were. So we, as an example of a success case, for example, we worked with P&G in 4 countries of Latin America, and we did 20 awareness trainings for leadership, HR, and managers. Just as you guys were saying, trainings for leadership, it's super important. HR cannot do anything alone. So we know that this culture work has to be transversal to the entire organization. So we build this courses so that it permeates through the whole company. And we got, fortunately, the first inclusions of people with disability in 4 countries of Latin America. And they're still working on this. We always say that culture, you don't stop working on it. Every day we find new ways of getting through more of the organization and people to actually believe on this strategy and the company's idea in this sense. About inclusive employment, we work on how to make processes accessible so that companies, once they stop working with us by themselves, can get diverse, attract diverse talent and actually retain them. With Walmart, we've got a huge success case of more than 100 people with disability employed on every single position, not only operational. We've also worked in this sense with the UN companies as specialized as McKinsey or PwC, Walmart, and much more. In this sense, we discuss what the best way of eliminating barriers through the whole process. And also we approach our job board, which now it's more than 230,000 people in Latin America. So it's an easy way, as someone was mentioning, to find talent, and so that people with disabilities can know what vacancies are close to them in their country. In the sense of community, and this is something that I saw a comment too, in the sense of barriers to education, talking about the barriers of English. So we decided to do academies. And this, we approached companies that were willing to do an exercise with their volunteers so they can train people with disability in their minimum requirements and train their own talents. So for example, with HSBC, we did this academy where 15 people with disabilities started this training on financial education and customer support, soft skills, finance administration. And once the academy was done, then HSBC could use them as future employees. So we got a 80% hiring rate. We're now planning on this year and on scaling this project so more and more people can get these types of opportunities. So this is a virtuous cycle where everybody in the company gets a win-win. If you have any questions or comments, Fides, you let me know and I'll stop immediately. And well, in accessibility, it's not only physical, as you guys know, it's also technological. We had a very, very successful case with Uber, where we did accessibility tests for users and drivers. Super interesting results. And also we do physical accessibility in enormous companies in Mexico City. This is an impressive, really, really impressive. And I think that's one of the biggest difference between Europe and Latin America, is that accessibility in cities is not one of the main issues in most governments. So for example, in Mexico, only 5% of the territory is accessible. So it's a battle that we're still fighting and that we are still convincing companies to improve not only their own buildings, but try to be more community aware in this sense. And yeah, the 90% of companies in Latin America are not physical accessible. So we're still talking about this issue. It's super important. And it's a battle that we're not leaving. In the marketing access in our model, this is something that it's really, really new in Latin America. One of the statistics that really blew my mind when we started at Valuable 500 was that only 4% of the companies actually do something about access people with disability in their own company. We know, and this is something that I read from another organization in Canada, that actually people with disabilities and their families are market the size of China. So this is another way of convincing companies that they're missing out on such a humongous and important market. So something that we did was with a low-cost Mexican airline, which is called Viva Aerobus. We tested their customer service channels, and we gave them a report, not just saying that by making it more accessible, you just win the disability market, but also all friends and family who travel with people with disabilities. So it was super interesting project, and we also, with other companies, have developed inclusive branding, positioning strategies, and market research, which is also another side of the economy that it's important for companies to look at. And basically communication, accessible communication for us is super important. We have developed e-learnings, videos, actually communicating knowledge, which I think is one of the most impressive barriers that we find in companies. A lot of mistakes on what, and ableism, as you were saying also. And it also erases most uncertainties and also communicates vacancies. So we started planning everything also through the intersectional approach. So Fides laughs because she's also working on that, I know. And we were not just looking at people with disability, but how it affects other types of groups, migrants, how it affects women, how it affects gender identity, social, economic background. It really helped us imagine how we needed to work and what the market was actually asking for. So in 2021, we started training people with disability in tech, and we trained 562 students, which 56 almost were women. And we also focused with the Inter-American Bank in Venezuela and migrants in Argentina and Chile, which we know it's a very vulnerable population right now. Around 7 million have left Venezuela, and it's people that leave their countries without any contacts, any support, anything. So we started targeting to train them and show another opportunities, so that they could feel more at home in Latin America. So 478 participating in soft skills. We did 12 groups of students between March and December, and 7 different virtual courses. Obviously, this was completely free for people with disabilities in Latin America. We financed this through organizations that we were working and with companies. And each course was 20 hours in training in total. Our current projects are right now, we have with the Inter-American Bank, we're working on a more specific project now that we know how this population, all the barriers that they're facing. So we're trying to, our main objective is that to train more than 500 Venezuelan migrants in Argentina and Chile. We're also publishing a diagnosis to identify obstacles, and share labor guides for migrants, how they need to look for jobs, where to look for jobs, what paperwork they need to do, because also we found that information, it's not easy and not very available and accessible. We have a project also this year and with google.org, where we're training 600 women with disabilities in tech. We are planning that at least 500 of these women with disability will generate incomes with this trainings. We know that tech, it's mainly men targeted. So we're looking for diverse strategies to find women and make this accessible for them. We also did a project, and we're about to finish this one with Santander, where financial inclusion we also believe is super important, and in Latin America we know it's a big problem. We did 10 seminars, and also all this knowledge is being more close for other banks that we work with, so that they have the main or little requirements that they ask for any job vacancy. So we also did a project of research in Latin America. We know that 85% of people with disabilities didn't have a bank account, or were not very aware of some main concepts of financial inclusion. So we're still working on this. We're planning in Mexico. I don't know if this is a world, but Green Meal. So we're getting around 8 banks together to work together and do a bigger project than we did with HSBC last year. Also, which I found super interesting, is that someone said in the exercise that there were no common statistics. And it's super true. And in Latin America, it's super difficult to get common methodology between all the countries. And since we work in 11 countries of Latin America, we decided to do the first Latin America survey in disability. So it's not very statistical rigorous, because we got from our database more than 4,000 responses. So it's not aleatory. We know the population that we were asking, but we needed data. There's absolutely no data in Latin America about disability. All that we have are census that not even inside the governments, they agree that the questions are being correctly, or that, for example, in Mexico, they said it's around 4% people with disability, but another 16% with the people that need adequations. So it's not clear. And we decided that we wanted to make clear, and that we wanted to bring out knowledge, and that we wanted to position also incluyeme as a source of information in this sense. So this is the first time that we did this. We are trying to do it maybe every 2-3 years, so that we can have more and more information about the population, the needs, and also the barriers. And lastly, we did also a financial inclusion research in Mexico with a bank. This brings more information that we do not have. And we did research about migrants of Venezuela in Argentina and Chile. I really wanted to go fast so we can start the talk and the discussion, because I think we have so many common issues, barriers, and success cases with companies working with us.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. I think I'm also partly speaking for the participants when I thank you for the insights. And just as a reminder to everybody who's listening from the participant side, I think that was also a great start into a teeny tiny interview format that I'm going to do with Gabby. And while we're talking, you're also free to post questions that will then be filtered towards us. And then we're going into the Q&A right after I've posed the 4 or 5 questions that we thought may arise, and that will give you, Gabby, also the chance to dig a little deeper, because I think one of the really, really interesting parts that you've mentioned, and that actually leads to my first question, is the Latin American market. Me personally, and I think everybody who has been to Latin America, I did a very European thing, which was absolutely underestimating the size of Latin America when it comes to population, when it comes to how long it takes from one destination to another, when it comes to time differences, within Latin America. So when you've talked, for example, about Procter and Gamble, right, as one of the best practices, what do you think is this particular thing that made it a Latin American challenge or the project? Because when you're talking about the Latin American region, are you talking about the countries that you're working in? Are you talking about the countries that you're working in with P&G? And especially with the data problem that you've mentioned, what even does that mean? So where do you work, like on a regional, on a national, and on a Latin American level?
We work, yeah, in every sense. So we have a team in each country. We are developing teams still in some of the other countries that maybe we have a little presence. And we work also in a regional level. So with companies, global companies, we give them the chance or the opportunity to work in an individual country or to do a project like regional wise. So with P&G, we work in Panama, we worked in in Panama, in Argentina, in Peru, and I think it was Mexico, the fourth one. And they all had similar problems because the company, the excuse is always the company culture, so that they have like minimum requires to be working at P&G. So for example, we had this vacancy in Panama that they wanted a receptionist, but it was 100% bilingual. And that in Latin America reduces the opportunities in 70%. It's much harder to find a bilingual person with disabilities because of all the barriers that they get in education, college-wise, well, since elementary school. So I asked them, like, why do you need a bilingual receptionist? They were like, oh, because all our vacancies, it's the minimum requirement. And I was like, okay, so it's fine, but how long, or what's the percentage of time that a receptionist will be speaking in English? Oh, well, I think we just have one client that doesn't speak Spanish. So it was like, okay, you cannot go back and tell HR, hey, we want to be more inclusive, we want to be more diverse. What about if someone can take that client and the receptionist the whole rest? And they agreed. So it's about flexibility, it's about questioning, I think, this culture of the company that requires certain methodology that nobody has questioned before. So I think also what worked and what is very particular about P&G is, for example, that everybody in the company actually interviews candidates. So it was super helpful to train in that sense, because every department had someone who had knowledge about ableism, who had knowledge about what was important to question the candidate in an interview, what wasn't, how to make an interview accessible. And I think that helped a lot. I don't know if I answered your question.
No, that's perfect. Thank you. I'm just going to always try to also connect your answer to what might be like especially interesting to the participants. And I think what we can take for Europe as an example is that we do not have that joint language. So actually see how much flexibility it gives to countries, to companies working Europe-wide, for example, that English is in a lot of senses a given, or in a lot of cases. It's not always, but then there is the possibility to work through it. And I think that is quite interesting to hear as well, especially when we're thinking about the example that you've mentioned. And I think that that is something that we advise our clients to do the same. It's obviously really, really important to spread the people that have a basic awareness about something and have gained some disability confidence in every single team. So the more there's a person that everybody can rely on within a team who has already had a training, the more likely it becomes for them to actually bring up the courage and take that first step to actually hire somebody. I'm very happy to have somebody from PNG Vienna here who's listening to that and then hopefully translating it right away. As you know, Gabby, and as many of you participants know, we're always trying to also add the community's perspective. So actually looking at the possibility of finding a job or retaining a job from a person who has a disability themselves. May that be a visible or an invisible one, and one that the person had from birth or some that they may have acquired. Now, looking at people with disabilities in your market, what do the people with disabilities you work with, because you do that as us, you always try to have people with disabilities in the trainings and on the projects as well. What do they tell you that their obstacle is that is specific for Latin America from a community's perspective?
I think the first barrier is education. So a friend of mine, she's a wheelchair user. She was telling me, you know, it's awful that I didn't get to choose my college because of the program or subject that I really wanted. I had to choose it because it was accessible. It was the only one accessible. So I think that's one of the main barriers that we get once they're in a labor search. And two, I think it's also, you know, these biases. When you enter an interview and you know that the people who's interviewing you, it's already has an idea of what you can or can't do. So I think that's one of the main barriers. In the trainings that we give, Lina, she has palsy, cerebral palsy, and she always tells this anecdote that's awful but true, and that happened to her. And she said she has a communication degree, a college degree. She went through all the stages of the interview that were made by phone, by Zoom or whatever. And when she got to her first day, they told her, sorry, we cannot sign the contract. And she was like, why? So like, because the doctor of the company says that you cannot go into your office because it's not accessible, because they have stairs. She's like, but I'm right here, you know, it is. I am at my office, or what it's supposed to be my office, and you're telling me that I can't when you're seeing me, you're physically seeing me. And they were like, sorry, it's rules of the company, and if you don't pass the medical test, we cannot give you this job. So there are billions of issues, you know, like technological issues too, and also the protectiveness of the company. They're like, we're not going to start hiring anyone if we're not completely accessible 100%. So I live in Mexico City, where the country or the city is 0% accessible, and we're worried about our own building. So it's possibilities, it's I think awareness and knowledge and communication what we most suffer from.
Thank you very much. And I think to translate that again into a European perspective, we get that a lot as well. So actually organizations have a very, very high standard towards themselves. They want to reach when it comes to accessibility before they actually get started with sourcing talents. And we keep telling them the same thing. And maybe some of you who are here today will hear from a Latin American perspective, where just when we're looking at the data, accessibility in public spaces, and when it comes to also public standards, is way lower than in Europe. People are still using that excuse. We want to be accessible before we hire, even though people will face even more challenges even on their way to work, or when it comes to public transport, for example. So I think that's a very, very interesting thing to see, because we actually have quite a high standard when it comes to some forms of accessibility, or at least when it comes to legal frameworks that cover accessibility. Gold plating is another topic, and actually the question of how the consequences look when it comes to not fulfilling those legal standards. But I think that is very much a different perspective that you're giving here. So thank you very much. And I think that also leads to a very important other question. You and I have discussed already, there are a lot of organizations that approach us that say, well, we have an organization and we cannot train everybody at once. Obviously, we're embarking on a journey that we also kind of currently have to remind the clients that needs a good amount of patience as well as persistence. When you are working with organizations, what are the common departments that you start your work at? And what are maybe unconventional ones that you've started with?
The conventional ones, it's mostly HR and leaderships, because we do in incluyeme diagnosis, so process diagnosis and cultural diagnosis. And this is, I think, the best way to start, because as I was saying, it's numbers, it's not perceptions. So with this diagnosis, we know where the areas of opportunity are. And we can tell the company, you know, there is red flag in your leadership department. Like nobody, for example, in the company knows any leader or high post level people who talk about these issues, not only disability, but any diverse D&I subjects, just gender, you know. So it's easier for us to convince the companies and tell them, okay, so we can see here that most of the companies have no idea about disability. And we can also tell around, I don't know, 85% of your employees know someone with disability. So it is an issue that should be attended. So we mainly start with HR, so they can get an easier inclusion, because we know that if they don't have the tools, they're not going to have any opportunities. But we also get, you know, the HR that, like, we have had 70 trainings, so we're ready. But once we send a candidate to the leader, he just gets scared, and, you know, there's biases that that person is going to need much more feedback and guideline, and that team is not going to be, it's not going to accept them. So we try to do those two trainings at the same time. And also we've started with very, very high levels of the company, because we know it's easier that if someone like the CEO tells everyone, you know, we are targeting this issue, we have to be more diverse in culture and in actually employment, it's much easier for the rest of the company to follow those steps. So that's,
I think that's wonderful and absolutely applicable to European or companies from other parts of the world as well. And obviously HR, and for that status quo analysis, HR plays a crucial role. It's a very good point to start, but there is actually always that contingency with leaders or people leaders or hiring managers that we also see, and that I'm sure a lot of you as participants have also experienced. And maybe you even are part of an HR department, and you know that you and your colleagues are really, really well trained, and that if people leaders were to approach you, you could give the right answers, but they are not approaching you because sometimes they find other reasons to not hire people with disabilities, or not even invite applicants one step further. So we have experienced that as well. And we actually really invite you to also enter questions, if you may have any, for the Q&A that tackle that issue as well. Gabby, because we're approaching the 1 hour mark, I would like to pose 2 little questions before I give the floor to the participants and ask you, we've heard about a lot of similarities, and we've actually gotten into myths and biases as well when we talked. What do you think are the most common myths, or one really big one that you face when you're working with companies? So the things that people assume about people with disabilities.
One, that it's going to take them more time to do anything. Two, they assume that because of the disability, they're not going to be able to do certain things. Three, I think it's also this misconception that the team is not going to accept them as a member of the team. And I think those three are the most common.
And when it comes to messages, so the things that you want participants today and participants of your trainings and your project to go home with, what do you think are like some of the action items that you are giving them, key components in order for them to make it work, that maybe some of the participants may find useful?
Yeah, super. So we give them a lot of testimonies from people with disabilities who are working, and also from companies that have already included a big number of people with disabilities to, by their experience, show all these biases and desmitificarlo. Sorry,
yeah,
for my
like
Spanish.
Demystify the things.
Exactly, that was the word I was looking for. We also want to show, for example, Lina, who's our training specialist, I think by her own experiences can tell them and show them what all the gains that diverse teams can bring to the table. I think knowledge about, you know, the what people can and cannot do, it's personal. It has nothing to do with the disability. And to ask the right questions about a vacancy, not focus on the disability instead of what the tasks are gonna really be. And I think those are the main things that we focus on. Try to normalize the disability, but also make them know that it is going to be a process, because us as a community, as the world, we need to work on it. We need to work on our biases. We need to work on our accessibility. So it's going to be a process. And it's not going to be like a one-year project and everything's fine. But we do need to normalize disability. I think that's the main concept that we work with.
Thank you very much. And I think that is a perfect way to link our little chat to the possibility for you as participants to actually pose questions. Please use the Q&A or F&A section for that, and then it will be moderated towards us. Before I ask you the first question that is quite concrete, I would like to just emphasize on what you've just said and stretch the last point. Both incluyeme and myAbility are really eager to always include people with disabilities perspectives, not only on a structural level, but very frankly on making people who participate in trainings and projects actually meet with people with disabilities. Even before, for many, they interview the first candidate or work with the first colleague that has disability. And that as a concept is working very well across the globe or across the Atlantic for both of us to actually see how people are clicking, okay, this is a human being. A lot of people who are joining may have worked with us in the past and know that one of the things we really emphasize on is, if you're looking at the way to describe a job and you're saying it involves a lot of communication, also make sure not to just think about the way you're thinking of communication, that may be over the phone, and ask yourself, well, what does communication mean for a potential candidate? And can communication also mean audiovisual communication, for example, which makes it accessible for a lot more candidates. So I think that is just a really important thing to add. And now when it comes to slowly but surely pushing organizations from a state point of view, somebody has asked, in Latin America, are there any legal regulations to motivate organizations to include people with disabilities, because Austria, for example, has a quota of 4% that is mandatory by law. Germany has a quota of 5% that varies in their legal implications. What can you tell us about that?
It depends. Peru has a quota. Chile has a quota. Argentina, but for the government, not for private companies. And I think that's it. And Costa Rica also has a quota. And it's difficult to say if it's working or not, because, for example, for Chile, we find it hard because they're only focusing on covering that quota, not actually like into building a culture that actually includes, but
Yeah.
it's like, okay, we cover the quota, we're okay. But there's also, like in some other countries, for example, Mexico, that doesn't really have a quota. Their companies are more interested in the diagnosis and starting with trainings. So it really depends. There's, for example, public policy in Mexico that the government gives certain amount depending on the disability. But then when we try to include them with a job, it's, the difficult decision if they want to stop receiving this money and going to the company or not. So I'm not sure if we're applying the right politics in that sense. I don't know if I answered the question.
Thank you very much. I think you brought to our mind that number one, again, you cannot stretch enough how big Latin America is as a market. So when you're talking about quotas, it's national answers for a global question that was posed, but also, and that is very, very important for everybody joining from whichever company, just because somebody fulfills the quota does not necessarily mean the organization can just make a tick underneath disability inclusion.
Completely.
There is way more to that. And we think that even though many companies still do not have 4% in Austria, for example, of people with disability employed, even if they do, and that will be a wonderful first step or a next step, there is still more to the journey. And that is a very, very important point to stretch. For those of you, because we know that it's kind of an important time slot that we're using with this webinar, who have to log off for some reason or another after 1 hour. Thank you so much for participating. We're going to give us 12 more minutes until 16:15 Austrian time, at least 4:15, in order to answer 1, 2, 3 more questions. We would love for you to also pose questions that you may still have. And I'm actually going to get right into the next one, but I didn't want to have people log off that may have to run somewhere without saying goodbye. There is another question, and you may have had this in some of your work projects. How can you take into account invisible disabilities? This person is giving people on the autism spectrum as an example into your teleworking policies in the context of the post-pandemic time. Very specific question. Thank you for that. So if you're taking into consideration that a lot of people are required to be present for the firm, so I guess it's going into flexible work hours as well. What can you tell us about that? What were your experiences with that?
We don't as incluyeme differentiate in the type of disability that much. What we do with our job board is that you register, and as a person with disability, you apply to whatever vacancy works better for you. Obviously there's a contact, so you can contact us directly and for us to check and be more aware if there are certain specifications that the person needs, so that we can talk to the company and talk to them and specify, reasonable adjustments that the person needs. I think in our case, it's more the other way around. that a lot of companies post-pandemic think or assure that people with disability would rather stay at home. So we're like more talk to the person, see what they need, what they want, and give them a flexible contract or way of working. So we try to tell them more to be more about the person and not the disability. But there's always, exceptions, and the person, the candidate can come directly with us and talk and see what we can do as an intermediate.
Thank you. And I think that's also a really important part. Also in part what connects our companies, it's looking at not only the global perspective when we're talking about location, but about a meta perspective on disability. So not really differentiating into the types of disabilities, especially taking into account that so many disabilities are not talked of or even disclosed when it comes to the employee's perspective towards their employer. But maybe an interesting factor too for people who might be participating from internationally operating organizations. The topic of disability inclusion is very much on the rise and has been in the past couple of years. And I assume you're also referring the people you're working with, P&G, in a certain nationality in Latin America, to local partners who work with specific disabilities. Have you seen those companies getting more successful, or have there been more companies established or even non-governmentals when it comes to actually people with disabilities and certain disabilities in companies or in small scale organizations?
I think there's a variety. In Latin America, there's been an increasing number of organizations and companies that work within a specific type of disability. And we're super happy about it because, as I was saying at the beginning, it's 85 million people in Latin America with disabilities, a huge problem that not incluyeme or myAbility can do by themselves. So we're really, really happy to see all these organizations and companies growing. I don't know if there's a specific disability that there's more. We, for example, have partners also, Especialisterne, who are also worldwide established, and they focus more on
people on the autism spectrum.
Yeah, exactly. So when we see a project and when we see something specific, we turn to them because of obviously of their experience and knowledge on the subject. But I couldn't give you a correct answer on the sense of if there's a specific disability that more organizations are targeting.
I think that is already wonderful. And I think it's also showing that what I have come to appreciate a great deal when it comes to disability inclusion, that as opposed to other sectors, even though we're working for profit, which also makes the value differently for a lot of organizations, it is very well known that there are people who have a very specific knowledge, may have more data or more specific data on their community, can help a great deal. So we actually are happy to also connect people with local partners, and I think that's what you're agreeing on to, and yeah. I think that is very, very important. At this point, I would like to say thank you very much for taking the time to be with us today, and thank you as participants. It's 5 minutes before our regular finish time, and we really like to also, from a perspective of accessibility, give you all the time to log off this meeting and log on to your next one, because back-to-back meetings are also a really big factor in post-pandemic work life. A last point that I would like to stretch, and that you've just said again, Gabby, there are 85 million people in Latin America that live with a disability. And for a lot of people we work with in organizations, the scope that they have is always Austria, Switzerland, and Germany. And imagine if the whole population of Germany and Austria más o menos, were people with disabilities and how we would deal with that as opposed to dealing with it on a national level. And I think that just puts into perspective what you as incluyeme are doing every day of the week and every month of the year, because especially that long distance work with a lot of different national legal frameworks, with a lot of different cultures, even not only when it comes to specific types of Spanish that I have encountered myself. I think that is something that we really want to give a little bit of an applause to, and thank you very much for being so open, sharing your insights.
Awesome.
And because there was another question, yes, we will definitely share all the contents with you as participants. We're happy for you to actually be asking that. So yes, we've said that, and we will be sharing the slides. Thank you very much, Gabby. Thank you to all you participants. I was very flattered to have such a wonderful guest and keynote person here and such a wonderful reception. And we will see you at our next webinar. Have a great rest of your afternoon if you're in Europe, and the rest of your day if you're in Mexico City, like Gabby. Thank you.